tongue. We've already said tongue. Tongue, again, moves the food around the mouth to make sure that all the food is chewed into small pieces, is torn into small pieces, to make sure all the food is made wet and moist, and to make sure that the enzyme amylase gets into the food to begin that process of breaking down carbohydrates in the mouth. Now, for example, if you put some rice in your mouth and you hold it in your mouth, you don't swallow it, but you hold it in your mouth, after about 10 minutes, it will begin to taste sweet. So normally rice doesn't taste very much of anything, but when you put it in, if you hold it in your mouth for about 10 minutes, it begins to taste sweeter. And that's because this enzyme breaks down some of the starch into simpler sugars that are much sweeter, simpler sugars that are going to be much sweeter, simpler carbohydrates. But the tongue will help all that food move around and do all of that. And then we look at the mechanical systems of the esophagus. The esophagus is basically just a tube. So when the food leaves the mouth, it goes down this esophagus, down this tube here into the stomach. Now, mostly the esophagus is mechanical. It's not really chemical, it's mechanical. And that's because it has muscle around it and it pushes the food down. It helps to push the food down. So imagine that you have a tube and you're squeezing it with your hand and you're pushing the food down. That's what the esophagus does. And sometimes you notice when you're swallowing food that it kind of gets stuck and you have to like try and get that muscle back to work. Well, that's what happens. The esophagus pushes down. It's called peristalsis, this particular movement, but we don't need to worry about that word. But that muscle movement creates peristalsis and pushes the food into the stomach. And by the way, that muscle movement of pushing the food through the intestines, through the digestive system, is there all the way. The stomach also has peristalsis. The large intestine and the small intestine also have peristalsis, this muscle movement. Okay, so the esophagus is usually about 25 centimeters long, so really about this long, but I think you know because you know where your mouth is and you know where your stomach is. That's how long your esophagus is. It transports and moves saliva, liquids, and foods from the mouth, and it's located just behind your breathing tube. The breathing tube is called the trachea, but it's just behind that, and it's in front of your spine. So that's where it is. The next part, the third system, stomach. Now here's the stomach, and as you can see, as we said here, it's a muscular sac. Now this has muscle on the outside. So we said your esophagus has muscle to force the food by peristalsis. Well, the stomach has muscle, and what happens is that muscle squeezes here, squeezes here, squeezes here. It squeezes the food in different parts. It doesn't just go like this, but it squeezes the food and moves the food around inside your stomach to make sure it's mixed up. Stomach. And what it does is it also makes acid inside the stomach. Now that's different from what you have in your mouth, because remember we said we produce saliva. Saliva is alkali. It's like milk. It's alkali. It's not acid. But here in your stomach, we have acid. Acid is inside the stomach. So the stomach is churning the food, it's mixing the food, and the acid in the stomach is breaking down some of the food. It also has some enzymes called peptidases, but basically it's beginning the breakdown of protein. It begins the breakdown of protein. So breaks down, oh, that's not correct. I should have to change that. and it's on the upper side of the abdomen. And pepsin, that's more like it. That's what it does. It breaks down protein into smaller pieces, using the enzyme pepsin, but also the acid. So the enzyme is pepsin. Nương song Sam?
Pepsin.
Everybody together, please. Pepsin. Nương song Sam?
Pepsin.
So far, we've talked about two enzymes. Here in the mouth, in the saliva, amylase. And here, pepsin. Amylase breaks down starch into carbohydrates, and pepsin begins to break down protein into smaller pieces. Not really the smallest piece, which is amino acids, but it just breaks down big pieces of food. And it also has one other thing inside here, which I didn't put on my slide. It has acid. Now the acid, nam grot, chumai? Acid. I'd like you all to say that word, acid. Nương song Sam.
Acid.
And I think the Pasatai is nam grot, chumai?
Yes.
And that acid is actually called hydrochloric acid. You don't need to remember that, but what I should write down, and I'll do this next time, why do you think we would have acid? Why do you think we would have nam grot in our stomach? Why? Why is it there? We know why we would have pepsin. That's to help break down the protein. We know why we would have amylase, because that will break down the starch. But why would we have acid in our stomach? What would acid do? Does anybody think? What would acid do? Okay. Now, let's think about something. When many of you were very little children and you had a delicious piece of chocolate, and sometimes when you're eating it and you drop a piece on the floor, what did you used to do? Did you leave it, or did you pick it up and eat it when your parents weren't looking?
Pick up and eat.
Yes, you picked it up and ate it. And sometimes your mother or your father or grandparents would say, no, don't eat the food. It's dirty. It's not nice. What did they mean when they said the food was dirty? Why did they say you shouldn't eat the food that fell on the floor? Why? Why did they say
bacteria?
Right, exactly. Because the food from the floor, if it fell on the floor, would have the bacteria. So if you drop your candy or your chocolate on the floor, and if you left it there for, say, more than 30 seconds, it might have bacteria. So when you put it in your mouth, because the mouth has alkali, it only has amylase, it doesn't kill the bacteria. But when the food goes down the esophagus into your stomach, the acid will kill the bacteria. It will kill most of the bacteria. But it's also not just the bacteria on the outside of the food. And this is important. It's also bacteria that might be on the inside of the food. And this is why you should chew food to small pieces. So when we go back to the mouth and we say you must chew food, the reason is because sometimes bacteria can be inside the food. Now, this can happen, for example, if you do not cook food very well. Often, some people will cook chicken, and they think the chicken is cooked nicely on the outside, but on the inside, it is not cooked. And bacteria can live on the inside of chicken or beef or pork or whatever. But on the inside of the food, the bacteria might still be alive if the food is not cooked. So this is a good reason why you must chew your food into small, small pieces. Because when the food goes into the stomach will take those small pieces and make sure that the acid and the protein and the pepsin get into the food and break it up smaller. But if the pieces of meat are too big, then sometimes the stomach cannot break all of the meat into smaller and smaller pieces. At this point, that means that the bacteria will then go through the stomach into the small intestine. And then we have a problem. Because if the bacteria is not killed in the stomach, it will go through into the small intestine. And then that, as we'll see in just 1 minute, is where all of the foods are absorbed into our body. Not all the foods, but a lot of it, including bacteria. So if we let bacteria get past our stomach and into the small intestine, we have a big problem, because now bacteria will go into our body. So remember that. The reason why the stomach has acid is to kill bacteria. So let's look at number 4 now, the pancreas. Now, we didn't mention this earlier, but because we're doing the chemical part, we also want to do this as well. Pancreas, and here's the pancreas. It's this little yellow thing right here. Pancreas. Now, the pancreas is very important because it not only makes enzymes, it also makes hormones. Hormones are chemicals that tell us, in this case, when we're hungry. And it also tells us how much glucose the body has. Now, you might think, so what? It's telling us how much sugar we have in our body. Well, that's because one of the big problems today for young children is something called diabetes. And that means this pancreas cannot easily tell how much sugar is in the body. And if it can't do that, that means sometimes the sugar is too high, and or it might mean the sugar is too low. And either way, it's not good for your body. And that's called diabetes if we have that. But this is important for regulating the enzymes and the hormones that will tell us how much sugar we have in the body. So it is balanced. And it's just above our stomach, behind the stomach, just right there behind the stomach. And it makes lots of different enzymes, proteases, lipases, trypsin, amylase. You don't have to remember all of these enzymes because you've done amylase before. But basically, it's putting lots of more enzymes into your body, into your small intestine particularly. And it breaks down all of the foods. It breaks down starches, carbohydrates. It breaks down proteins, and importantly, it begins to break down fats. This is the first place where fats begin to break down. So that's important.